I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. I've logged countless hours behind the wheel, driving across the vast and lonely stretches of Canada from Alberta to Nova Scotia. Long hauls and empty roads don't faze me. I'm used to the isolation, the dark highways, the eerie forests hugging the edge of the asphalt. But one night, deep in the Canadian wilderness, I came closer to death than I ever care to again. It was late October and I was hauling a full load of construction supplies from Calgary to a small town in northern Ontario. The route took me through some of the most remote parts of the country, endless forests of black spruce and trembling aspen, broken only by the occasional dirt road or small town. By late afternoon the sky was beginning to dim, casting a pale orange glow into my canopy. The road ahead was nearly empty. I hadn't seen another vehicle in almost 3 hours. Just my rig, the cracked pavement, and the forest. Out here there was no cell service, only my CB radio, and even that had been quiet for the last 100 miles. The monotony was heavy, the kind of silence that makes you sink into your own thoughts. But then, in a moment, just ahead, something caught my eye. A vehicle pulled off onto the gravel lay-by siding. As I got closer, I saw it was an old tow truck, parked at an odd angle with one of its doors wide open. The truck itself was dented and old, with mud caking the sides and fender. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder a few meters ahead. My truck rumbled to a gentle stop to the sound of crunching gravel. I got out and cautiously approached the truck. It was empty. My first thought was that the driver had run into trouble and left to find help. But something was off. The keys were still dangling in the ignition, and a lighter and cigarettes were strewn across the ground. Considering my next best course of action, I waited in my cab for a few minutes, presuming that the driver had probably stepped out into the woods for a toilet break. But as the minutes passed, I started to feel uneasy. The forest was still, too still, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing. I don't know why, but my gut was telling me something was alarmingly wrong. After 10 minutes, I climbed out of my rig and grabbed my flashlight and approached the tow truck once more. The driver's seat was empty of items. There were no personal belongings inside, no phone, no wallet, not even a jacket. It was as if the driver had simply evaporated. I circled the truck, shining my flashlight into the woods and calling out, "Hello? Anyone there? Are you okay?" My voice was swallowed by the vastness. Nothing returned. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees that stood there silently watching my every move. I stood by the truck for another 10 minutes, scanning the brush line and waiting. There was still no sign of anyone. Part of me wanted to keep looking, but the sun had set further. I was miles from any help and on a tight schedule. I figured the best thing I could do now was notify the authorities once I made it to the next town, which I figured was about 8 hours away. I climbed back into my cab and pulled away, watching the empty tow truck shrink in my side mirror. Something about it didn't sit right, but I told myself that people get careless. Maybe the driver had just walked off in frustration or gone to flag somebody down. The sun had set fully by the time I'd been driving for another 30 minutes. The road was a black ribbon cutting through the trees, my headlights the only source of light, and that's when I spotted something up ahead. A pair of blinking hazard lights flashing weakly in the distance. As I got closer, I could see it was a small sedan pulled over at an awkward angle. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. I slowed to a crawl, my stomach twisting. Not again, I thought to myself. Maybe this is where the tow truck driver was headed, or had reached. I parked behind the sedan and killed the engine. With my flashlight in hand, I stepped out to the cold night air. The wind had picked up, sending a chill across my body that my shirt did little to block. The trees were now dark, imposing, observing, and passing silent judgment on my actions. I approached the car cautiously, calling out, "Hello? You alright in there?" No answer. The car, like the tow truck, was completely empty. The interior light illuminated an abandoned purse which lay on the passenger seat. The sight of it made me feel queasy. I checked it for ID, but there was nothing. Then, my flashlight caught the gravel near the front tyres. It was disturbed. It looked like something heavy had been dragged out from the driver's side, towards the forest, as though someone had been on the floor, writhing and scraping the gravel with their legs. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I could see the rapid puffs of moisture leaving my mouth in the cold air. I walked slowly towards the edge of the road where the forest pressed in. My light illuminated broken branches and flattened grass. Another clear path had been created leading into the dark, as though somebody had been dragged. None of this made any sense. 2 separate vehicles on the same road, abandoned. No accident, no drivers, and based on the condition of the vehicles, whatever had happened recently. Clutching at straws, I decided to see if the sedan would actually start. At least I could figure out if it was broken down or not. Turning the keys, the engine roared effortlessly to life before settling into a smooth, animalistic purr. The engine was fine. In fact, it was more than fine. It was flawless. This only raised more questions in my mind. Why then had the driver left? Was I interpreting the scene correctly? Had somebody been dragged from the car? Perhaps somebody was injured and crawled into the forest for whatever reason. I've seen injured people act irrationally before, so it didn't seem far-fetched. Feeling more vulnerable by the second, a sudden realization settled in my now racing mind. What if whatever happened to these 2 vehicles happens to me? In the light of the situation, my courage was beginning to waver. Mustering all my resolve, I called out again one last time. "Hey, anybody need help?" I shouted before straining to hear a response. My voice echoed and reverberated into the towering darkness, swallowed up by the vastness of where I was. Seconds passed, and still nothing. Just as I was about to turn back, I wiped my brow with the back of my hand, and that's when I heard it. A sharp crack, followed by a thud somewhere to my left. I froze, for a split second wondering what had happened. I thought it might be a branch breaking, but then came the unmistakable reverberation of a distant boom. The sound echoed through the trees as once quiet birds came to life in the invisible darkness. My chest tightened as the realization sank in. That was a gunshot. Another crack and a snap. Someone was aiming at me. I turned and bolted for my truck. My boots crunched the gravel, but before I could reach my cab, another snap tore through the night. This time the bullet struck the road just a few feet behind me, sending up a puff of dust into the air. Panic surged through my veins. My hands were trembling as I fumbled to open the door. From the direction of the forest, I heard shouting, multiple voices yelling frantically. I leapt into my cab, slammed the door shut, and threw the truck into gear. My tyres skidded on the loose gravel as I wrenched the wheel and lurched back onto the highway. In my mirror, I could see the shapes emerging from the trees. 2 figures in dark clothing. One of them raised what I was sure was a rifle. Not hesitating, I slammed my foot on the gas and carried on. I kept my foot pressed to the floor, the engine growling as my rig thundered through the empty stretch of road. The steering wheel felt thick beneath my trembling hands and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. The empty highway stretched out ahead of me, but when I glanced in my side mirror, my stomach dropped. A vehicle was tailing me. Its headlights were distant, but unmistakably closing in. My eyes flickered constantly between the road ahead and the mirror, watching the vehicle behind me draw closer and closer. At first I couldn't make out the make or model, just the predatory glow of its headlights piercing the darkness. But as the distance closed, the shape became clearer. It was a dark, nondescript pickup truck, dented and mud-streaked, with no plates visible. Its grille was wide and imposing, the beams of its headlights cutting jagged cones of light through the night. The road I was on was narrow and winding, flanked by dense forest on both sides. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, with faded dividing lines that I could barely see. The sharp turns came quickly, forcing me to ease off the accelerator to avoid tipping my load. At these points, they gained on me. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to breathe evenly, but my chest was tightening with each passing second. My knuckles were white against the wheel. My eyes kept darting towards the mirror, tracking their approach. 50 feet behind, 30, then 20. The vehicle wove erratically, nudging towards the oncoming lane before jerking back behind me. They were testing me, looking for an opening. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't let them pass. I shifted slightly onto the centre of the road, positioning my rig dead in the middle of both lanes. The entire 18-wheeler became one rolling barricade, making it impossible for them to overtake without veering into the ditch or slamming into the forest. But they weren't backing off. The pickup truck closed distance again, inching closer, riding my tail so closely that I could barely see their headlights. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing against me, predatory and relentless. My mirrors caught the faintest glimmer of movement in their cab. One of them leaned forward slightly, his silhouette barely visible through the windshield. My throat tightened. What were they planning? Then the truck lunged. The driver swerved hard to the left, attempting to pass. My heart shot into my throat. I immediately yanked the wheel to the left, cutting them off. My tyres skidded slightly, the back end fishtailing from the sudden manoeuvre. For a brief moment, my trailer lurched, shifting slightly off-centre, and I fought to hold it steady. They fell back, but only for a moment. Seconds later they made another attempt, this time swerving right. My chest was heaving, sweat pouring down my face as I jerked the wheel right in response, blocking them again. The rear tyres of my trailer clipped the loose gravel on the edge of the road, spitting up stones and bursts of dust. I felt the entire rig shudder from the sudden shift. "Come on, hold it together," I muttered to myself through gritted teeth. I could hear the rattle of my load shifting slightly again from the abrupt movements. My arms were trembling from the deep grip I had on the wheel. My mouth was dry and my breathing came in shallow gasps. The pickup fell behind once more, but it didn't give up. I watched in my side mirror as they pulled so close I could almost make out the contours of the driver's face, a blurry smear of hollow eyes and taut, unsmiling mouth. A jolt of raw fear shot through me, and that's when they made their attempt, the most aggressive yet. They swerved onto the oncoming lane, but instead of slowing when I blocked them, they gunned it, pressing forward alongside me. For a moment we were there, side by side, my cab dwarfed only by the massive trailer at my back, their truck only a few feet away from my driver's side window. I glanced over. There were 3 men sat inside. Their faces were illuminated by the harsh white glow of their dash lights. One of them, the man in the passenger seat, turned his head slowly towards me. His eyes were cold and vacant, but locked onto mine with a detached, unsettling calm. Then he slowly dragged a finger across his throat, keeping his stare locked with mine. My stomach churned with dread. The truck began to drift slightly towards me, its tyres edging towards mine. They were trying to push me, force me off the road. "Not like this," I growled in my teeth. I slammed my fist against the horn, the blaring sound piercing the night, but they didn't flinch. They kept drifting closer. I felt the entire rig tremble slightly as their mirror clipped my trailer's fender, sending a dull jolt through the frame. I jerked the wheel hard right, sending my truck veering towards the shoulder. The sudden move was enough to surprise them. They braked slightly, falling back behind me once again. My trailer kicked up a burst of loose gravel and dust, but I stayed on the road. I was breathing heavy, my chest tight with terror. My legs were trembling against the pedals, and in my mirror I saw them slow down again slightly, just enough to keep their distance, but they didn't turn back. They stayed on me, relentless and patient. For nearly an hour they trailed me, keeping their headlights locked onto my rear. Occasionally they would accelerate slightly, only to slow back down, taunting me, making sure I knew that they were still there. I didn't dare ease up. My eyes burned from not blinking, my jaw ached from clenching my teeth. And then, just as I was nearing the outskirts of a small town, they suddenly accelerated. The truck veered into the oncoming lane and roared past me. As they pulled alongside, I glanced over again. The same man in the passenger seat locked eyes with me. His face twisted into a dead, expressionless glare. His lips moved, forming silent words that I couldn't hear, but the malice in his eyes was unmistakable. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, they tore past me and vanished into the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the inner town. My hands were still trembling as I parked in front of a local police station. Thankfully, there was still somebody inside. I practically ran inside. Breathless, I relayed everything to the officer at the front desk. He listened calmly and carefully taking notes. When I described the vehicles and the gunshots, his expression darkened. He immediately called in several officers to investigate the stretch of road that I'd just described. After filing the report, the officer offered to have a squad car escort me 20 miles out of town, just to be safe. I took him up on the offer. The entire drive I watched the woods. I kept expecting to see headlights in my mirror or hear the sharp crack of another gunshot, but I made it out safely. A few weeks later, I got a call from the local authorities. They'd investigated the area and found the tyre tracks, spent bullet casings and signs of a struggle near both vehicles. The tow truck, it was reported stolen, but no sign of the driver. The sedan, it was abandoned. Its owner, a local woman, was reported missing that same day. They never found her. And the men in the car? No leads. I've driven a lot of lonely roads since then, but I've never forgotten the sound of that first shot cutting through the stillness. And every time I pass an empty vehicle on the roadside, I feel my throat tighten and my foot press a little heavier on the gas. I've always enjoyed driving the backroads, especially through the forested mountain countryside of New England. Something about the isolation, the winding tree-lined roads, and the occasional picturesque clearing has always been peaceful to me. I liked the freedom of it. No traffic, no people, just me, the car, and miles of quiet road. That's why, when I decided to take a solo trip through Vermont, I chose to avoid the major highways entirely. I wanted the scenic routes, the forgotten stretches of road that seemed to cut right through the untouched wilderness. In hindsight, that was my first mistake. It was early October and the trees were still rich with amber and crimson, and the leaves blanketed the roads in patches. The mountains stretched far on either side, disappearing into the dense, endless forest. The sun was low, casting long golden streaks through the thinning canopy. I had driven for hours without seeing another car, and while the solitude felt comforting at first, it soon became unsettling. The forest seemed denser out here, oppressive even. The further I drove, the more uncertain the road became. The sky turned an orange-grey as dusk approached, and the occasional rocky cliff face jutted out just beside the asphalt, making the road feel claustrophobic. It was around then that I spotted him. At first I thought I was imagining it, a shadowy shape perched on a flat rock at the edge of a small roadside lay-by. But as I got closer, the figure sharpened into view. It was a man sitting completely still with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands together. His head was slightly lowered and his gaze was fixed on the road ahead, unmoving. As I drove closer, I slowed down slightly, my curiosity piqued. Something about him struck me as off. His clothes were weathered, faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a flannel shirt with flaying cuffs. Over that he wore a brown jacket that looked old and stiff, as though it had been left out in the rain and dried too many times. His hair was unkempt, a mess that stuck out in uneven clumps beneath a dirty baseball cap. He was dishevelled, but not in the way of a lost hiker or a stranded traveller. There was something deliberate about his stillness, calculated almost. I felt a strange flicker of unease as I rolled closer. He didn't move, he didn't turn his head to watch me. He just stared straight ahead with a vacant, almost trance-like expression. His eyes were hollow, distant, and utterly devoid of emotion. Something wasn't right. There was no car, no bike, and no visible gear. Just him sitting there in the middle of nowhere like he had been waiting. For what or who, I didn't know. I like to think of myself as a good Samaritan, so I couldn't leave right away. Maybe something had happened, and maybe he was in shock. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride into town or anything?" The man slowly turned his head towards me. His eyes were distant, unfocused, and without blinking, he shook his head once. "No, I'm waiting." I glanced around, confused. There was no car, no sign of anyone. "Waiting for what?" I asked. He smiled faintly, an odd, disarming smile, and said, "I already called my brother." At the same time, he pulled out his phone and waved it at me sarcastically. I hesitated. He couldn't have called. The reception out here was dead. I'd been checking my phone all afternoon and hadn't had a single bar. There was no way he could have called anyone. I glanced at my phone again, confirming there was no service. Maybe he was confused, so I pressed on once more just to make sure I was happy that I'd done my part. "Do you want me to let somebody know that you're out here when I reach the next town?" I asked, feeling uneasy. That was when his expression changed, his face hardened, eyes narrowing slightly. "No," he said sharply. "Don't tell anyone you saw me." There was something in his tone, a quiet, restrained anger. His eyes were cold now, and he was staring directly at me. "Just drive on," he said coldly. I nodded awkwardly, feeling my pulse quicken. "Have a safe trip," he said with a smirk. Something about the way he said it filled me with unease. Without another word, I rolled up the window and pulled away. As I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw him still sitting there, motionless, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. 10 minutes later, the forest seemed darker and the tree line closed in around the narrow road. The last streaks of sunlight barely pierced through the canopy, and the winding curves made it impossible to see more than 100 feet ahead. That was when I spotted it, a black SUV parked in a shallow lay-by just ahead on the right. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, a nondescript vehicle with dark, tinted windows. But as I approached, I noticed that it was idling, headlights off, engine barely audible. 2 men sat inside, motionless. Even through the dim light, I could see that they were staring at me, both of them. Their eyes locked onto me as I drove by. Their expressions were impossible to read, blank, almost lifeless, but their eyes didn't waver, not for a second. As I passed, I felt my grip on the steering wheel tighten. A cold, prickling sensation crawled down my neck. Why were they just sitting there? 30 seconds later, I glanced in my rearview mirror and felt my stomach drop. The SUV was now moving, slowly rolling onto the road. At first I tried to dismiss it. It's just a coincidence. They're probably heading into town. But when I eased off the gas, they didn't overtake me. Instead, they matched my speed perfectly, hanging back just far enough to keep me in their line of sight. I continued slowly, hoping they would pass, but they didn't. The SUV stayed locked onto me like a shadow. It was subtle, deliberate, and undeniably predatory. The longer it followed, the heavier the dread in my stomach grew. My eyes kept flickering into the mirror, half expecting to see them pulling closer. The once familiar road now felt strange and hostile, and the towering forest on either side suddenly seemed like a perfect place for something or someone to disappear. The SUV continued to follow for another 5 minutes until I eventually rounded a sharp bend and my headlights swept over the road ahead, revealing a truck parked squarely across both lanes, blocking the way. It was old and rusted, a battered pickup truck with faded blue paint and patches of corrosion along the wheel wells. The taillights were dark and the driver's side door hung slightly ajar, rocking faintly in the breeze. I slowed to a crawl, my headlights illuminating the uneven gravel and the weeds growing through the cracks in the asphalt. My first thought was that it had broken down, but as I rolled closer, my stomach tightened. There were no sign of hazard lights, no reflective triangles, just the truck, dead in the middle of the road, cutting off any route forward. I glanced over into the rearview mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. The SUV was there, pulling up behind me, closer than before. Its high beams flashed on, flooding my car with light. My pupils shrank, and for a brief moment I felt completely disorientated. At this point I saw them. 2 men emerged from the forest, just behind the truck, stepping out of the shadows. Both were wearing camouflage hunting jackets and trousers, the kind you'd expect to see in the backwoods. Their boots crunched over the gravel as they walked with slow, deliberate steps towards my car. They were burly, thick-shouldered, bearded, and rough-looking, and each carried a tool. One had a tire iron gripped loosely in his hand and was swinging it slightly with each step. The other held a heavy monkey wrench, tapping it against his palm with rhythmic, deliberate thuds. The hair on the back of my neck bristled, my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. My throat tightened as they closed distance. Their faces were shadowed, but I could see enough, the way their eyes locked onto mine with cold, predatory focus. I glanced in the mirror again and my stomach dropped further. The SUV had stopped only a few feet behind my car, boxing me in. I could make out the silhouettes of the men inside. Their doors were opening now. I watched in disbelief as 2 figures stepped out. One held a wooden bat and the other a wrench. They lingered by the SUV, watching, waiting. The man with the tire iron was now just feet from my window. His face was partially obscured by the dim glow of my headlights, but his eyes were narrowed, calculating. He adjusted his grip slightly, his knuckles whitening as he curled his fingers tighter around the tool. "Hey buddy," a voice called out from the SUV. It was low and casual, but there was something chillingly forced about the tone. "Step out of the car, we just want to talk." My pulse was hammering against my skull. I could feel it in my throat, choking me. My legs were trembling beneath the wheel, but I didn't move. I was frozen, trapped between them. The road ahead was blocked. The SUV was inches from my bumper. I was surrounded. The men advanced a few more steps. My headlights caught the brief glimmer of metal in their hands, tools meant for breaking things, for smashing. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. I'm not getting out of this car, no matter what, I told myself. Like a pack of dogs, they all closed in. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. With a burst of adrenaline, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal. My tyres screamed against the asphalt, kicking up sprays of dust and dirt and pebbles. The sudden acceleration caught the men off guard. The one with the tyre iron lurched backwards, eyes wide, stumbling out of the way as my car surged forward. I swung the wheel violently to the right, aiming for the narrow gap between the rusted pickup truck and the tree line. My headlights swept over the gnarled branches and dense underbrush as I careened off the road, my car's front bumper plunging into the tangle of shrubs and saplings. For a terrifying moment, the tyres spun uselessly in the dirt, kicking up clumps of earth but failing to catch. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear the men shouting behind me, angry, guttural voices, closing the distance, but I willed the car to go. I yanked the wheel hard to the right and threw the car into reverse, slamming the gas again. The wheels lurched backwards, spitting mud. The rear tyres finally caught traction, and I swung the front end out of the brush, fishtailing violently back onto the road. In the mirror, I saw the men leap back again, startled by my sudden manoeuvre. One of them swung the tyre iron, smashing it against my rear quarter panel, leaving a deep dent. The sharp crack made me flinch, but I didn't slow down. I floored the gas, my car shuddering as it barreled forward. The truck loomed closer, blocking the road, but I didn't stop. With no other choice, I veered halfway into the tree line again, scraping against the branches as I carved a narrow path alongside the truck. The underbrush clawed at the sides of the car. The tyres thudded over jagged rocks and uneven ground, and the suspension groaned in protest. I could hear branches snapping against the side mirror, and for a split second, I thought the car might get stuck again, but somehow, it didn't. I wrenched the wheel back towards the road, the car jerking violently as I fought for control. My tyres screeched as they hit the pavement, and I shot forward, leaving the men behind. In the mirror, I saw them standing there, frozen, watching me. Their faces were blank and expressionless. I didn't stop driving for nearly an hour. My hands were still trembling, knuckles white on the wheel. My throat was dry and my eyes kept flickering to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights creeping up behind. When I finally reached a small gas station near the next town, I pulled in and sat there for several minutes, hands shaking violently against the steering wheel. The scratches and the dents on the side of my car were deep and unmistakable. The rear quarter panel was warped where the tyre iron had struck it, and flecks of dirt and leaves clung to the fender from where I'd ploughed through the brush. I stumbled out of the car, legs weak and unsteady, and made my way to the gas station. The clock gave me a confused glance, probably wondering why I was so pale and shaky. My voice cracked slightly as I explained what happened. His expression changed immediately. He grabbed the phone and called the sheriff's office. When the officer arrived, he was calm but professional, jotting down notes as I shakily recounted events. I could hear the doubt in his tone. He was patient but skeptical, asking if I was sure the vehicles were real and not some disorientated overreaction. I pointed out the damage to my car, the freshly dented panel and the streaks of dirt and pine needles embedded along the wheel wells. Seeing the damage to my car, he took my story more seriously. He drove out to check the area, but on his return he mentioned that there was no sign of a pickup or an SUV or anybody out there, just miles of empty road. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about the incident. The man on the rock, he had been the spotter, scoping out cars and marking drivers. The SUV and the pickup truck, they had been the snare. I feel very lucky to have escaped. I know just how close I've come to vanishing in the forested mountains of New England. Just another missing person with nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a black SUV as the only clues.